Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're here today. We have Beth Tyson back. And if you missed our first episode about understanding childhood trauma with Beth Tyson, please go back and listen to it because it was an amazing episode. So amazing that we had so many people email sending requests for topics for Beth to talk about. And so she's back today to talk to us about some specific questions that families had. And if you'll remember, Beth is an author, a public speaker, and she's also a psychotherapist. And she has a newsletter called Childhood Trauma Newsletter. And she sends that out to families to help them understand the impacts of childhood trauma. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to her and get connected. And with that, I'll say, let's get to Beth.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So we're going to talk. Yes. We're going to talk more about trauma, but with some specific things now that we understand what trauma is and how to be a more trauma informed parent. I think parents have some more questions about this process. And we covered some of these things a little bit in our last conversation, but to get a little bit more in depth. So talk to me about, can people experience trauma differently in life? So 2 people, same event, can it be processed differently for them?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's kind of one of the core principles of trauma is that it is subjective, which means that it is an individual experience that can only be determined by the person, whether or not it felt traumatic. And I think we often get into the compare game of like, well, that wasn't as bad as what so-and-so went through, so it's not trauma. No, it can't be trauma. We often do that to ourselves. Like we don't recognize it in ourselves because we are like, well, no, so-and-so went through something way worse than that. I don't have trauma. When oftentimes we actually do have trauma and we're dismissing it because we're like, no, it wasn't bad enough. And so any circumstance that overwhelms your ability to cope with everyday life, with relationships, with going to work, with sleeping at night, or interferes with your eating or your physical health, these are all things that could be possibly traumatic to you. So when you're struggling with anxiety, there may be a trauma there. And if you're struggling with depression, it could be from a trauma. So some of these things that we've labeled mental health disorders could actually be trauma responses. And I think that's important for people to understand about trauma, is that we often label it as many other things, when at the core of it, it's something that has happened in your environment that has overwhelmed your ability to cope. And your nervous system the fear center of your brain is just on fire and is on high alert. And so that hypervigilance, I don't think I mentioned that in the last episode, but that's another big symptom of trauma, is being on edge and being on alert for constant threats everywhere. That can be one of the main symptoms of trauma. And so yeah, anything that makes you feel that way, that puts you in a state of persistent fear that something bad is going to happen. And that's a very personal experience, because what one person is afraid of, another person might not be afraid of. It could be, the lack of support that you have in your life that makes something feel traumatic. To go through something alone, right, is much more upsetting than to have somebody by your side supporting you, telling you it's going to be okay, that they've got you, that, they're there for you no matter what, someone to cry with, to vent to. That's a very different experience than someone who's going through, a situation and has nobody there with them to support. Yeah. So that's why it's so individual and subjective.
Yeah. Which can be hard then for us to acknowledge that potential for trauma. So you said something interesting, and I don't know if this would be true, but I wonder if we find ourselves comparing our experience to somebody else's, if that just in itself could be labeled trauma, like not the experience of doing that, but if we are trying to say this isn't that big of a deal because so and so has had this more, like maybe that just in and of itself is a sign that it's trauma because we're trying to work through that piece of trying to justify to ourselves like this isn't such a big deal, but our body and our brain is saying this is a big deal, and to kind of pull ourselves away from that, but then we like miss out on the opportunity to like heal if we're labeling things as like not a big deal, but they tend to find themselves back on the surface at some point, right? We can't keep them away for that long. And it's going to, oftentimes it presents itself as anger, right? Or being afraid of a lot of things. But I mean, it does come back if we don't deal with it. So that's why it's so important to identify if something's traumatic too.
Yeah.
So do you think, I mean, this is kind of along the lines of what we just said, but do you think that kids can experience something traumatic, like their house burns down or they are in a car accident or the death of a parent and them not feel like that was traumatic? Like they seem okay and they're saying they're okay. Like, is that possible? Can kids experience something traumatic and not be traumatized? This is a tricky question.
That is I don't even know if I can answer that honestly, because I think with trauma, trauma in children can manifest later.
Mm-hmm.
So they may seem fine now. They may seem like they coped with the death of a parent really well. But then in their 20s, they're addicted to substances or, having problems with relationship after relationship after relationship or, really struggling with anxiety or depression. And so I think it's really hard to say what if that is even possible. Because I don't know if there's any research on that, of like.
Yeah, I don't know of any either.
Yeah.
I think this is probably a question that I was curious about because sometimes I have situations in my practice where a parent will be like, okay, this traumatic thing happened. It would be, so, I'm an EMDR therapist too. And we talk about things being a big T trauma or little T trauma being like something big T is like everybody understands it. Like you say this thing and everybody's like, oh my gosh, that's traumatic. Or little T is more like those personal traumas where it's something that maybe not everybody would understand. But like those big T traumas where the parents are like, this happened, this big thing, like our house fire, right? And then the kids saying, I'm fine. I mean, yeah, that happened, right? And so it's a hard balance for me sometimes too of like, if the kid's presenting as fine, it's like we educate, like this is what trauma can look like and, working through that and processing. But sometimes at that time, they're just not in a place where there's something tangible to navigate. And so it's also just like educating the parents on what to be looking for in the future if something comes up, but then also just like being that supportive, empathetic parent to be curious about what's going on with their lives. And because it may be that they're in survival mode. So they're not processing the trauma at that time. Right. And so it may be months or years later that they're finally able to be in a place in their body where they can actually process that. So yeah, I don't know that I know the answer to this either, but I think I wanted parents to have this idea of like, sometimes things happen and we want to label them as traumatic. Maybe for a kid at that point, they're not in a place where they can actually process that trauma.
Right.
And so keeping your ears open, right? And your eyes open to their behaviors of like even later that could be hard. And I know that in my own life, when my mom died, my kids were all different ages and that it was a sudden death. She died from COVID. And so like we didn't, plan for that. Right. And so that experience was different for all of my kids. And, as a therapist who is trauma informed, I'm like trying to minimize the amount of trauma that it's creating. But my mom was an important part of our lives, right? So like that. And I think, years later now, I'm seeing how that impacts each of my kids very differently. And for some of them, we were processing when it was happening, right? And then for some of them, we were like in survival. And so then we didn't. And so then it's like settling into the body later. And so, sometimes I had to put my therapist hat on at home too, to be like aware of those things happening, that is a big deal. So I don't know that there's a perfect answer to this, but just that, we have to, even if our kids say they're fine, right? Like it's not about like constantly asking them, but for something big to happen in their lives, or something that we're perceiving, like our spidey senses saying, this is a big deal. It may be like giving them space from that, but then coming back and talking about it at a later time, when maybe they're more able to be in that thinking part of their brain. Or their emotional part of their brain. Sometimes we need to be in those emotions too. So depending on your child. So is there anything that we can do to protect our kids from trauma? Cause I know, as a parent, we're trying to like keep our kids safe. Like that's our major priority. Is there anything we can do to protect them from trauma?
Yeah. And I think it's going to be the sort of the same answer that I gave from the first part of this conversation, but that it's our relationship. It's really and it's rooted in our relationship, and it begins in infancy, begins at the beginning of life with being that person who they can trust and who is safe and who is trustworthy and who is honest with them. Because when you have a strong relationship with your parents, then you will go to them with challenges, and you will go to them with, things that feel uncomfortable or don't feel right. The child's going to come and tell you, and there might be time to stop something from happening if they're talking with you a lot and sharing their experiences with you and they trust you. So that's one way is to fortify your relationship and the attachment between you and the child, starting at birth or before in the womb even. And if you haven't done that, there are things that you can do, because we're all learning, right? A lot of this information is new. So if your children are teenagers and you're just learning about this way of parenting, and you're like, oh man, I wasn't doing that stuff. It's never too late to start, right? It's never too late to start, because our brains are changing. They're malleable throughout the lifespan, even into our 90s and 100s. Like our brains are still able to adapt and to change. And the most malleable they are is in childhood. So the sooner you start to prioritize your child's mental and emotional well-being, the better for them long term. And it's just never too late to start trying. So I think that it has to be, your relationship is the number one way to protect your child. But also being aware of some of these threats that are out there. So I do training on child abuse prevention. I'm the co-chair of the Pennsylvania Child Abuse Prevention Team. And educating yourself and knowing what the realities are and the threats are online, and having structure and rules around, where they're allowed to use screen time. So like one of the rules is, in our family is like, you're not allowed to use your phone in the bathroom or in your bedroom, because that's where the research shows the majority of, online like abuse takes place. And so, being aware of what your children are accessing and watching and having controls and over things that are happening online, that's where your child is most likely to experience trauma nowadays, is online. And so your community is actually a much safer place to be and out in and doing things in than your online world. And so really educating yourself around how to protect your children online is something that can prevent trauma from happening. And then, obviously knowing the signs of tricky people,
Mm-hmm.
so, grooming is a thing that takes place, and it can look like an adult who's just really interested in your kid and is just really trying to be supportive. But if you notice that there's an adult who is like wanting to spend time with your child for free,
Mm-hmm.
that could be in addition to coaching or in addition to, whatever, any adult who wants to spend a time with your child for free, is a warning flag, in my opinion. And also knowing that majority of abuse, like some crazy amount, I think it's like 90 or 95% of abuse is from people that the child knows.
Mm-hmm.
It's someone in the child's life already. So, and most of it is a family member, majority family member. So, we get so concerned about strangers and about, people we don't know. That's where I think my fear always lies. But the reality is that 9 times out of 10, it's happening within the family. And so paying attention, being aware, checking on your kids when they're at a get together and you haven't seen them in a few minutes, like go check, see what's going on in that basement,
Mm-hmm.
let's go
Mm-hmm.
downstairs and see what the cousins are up to, like
Mm-hmm.
just, you kind of have to stay aware of these things and stay on top of it because it is very common, thing that happens. I'm talking here more about like sexual abuse or verbal abuse or emotional abuse, and that could be happening that flies under the radar. And so, yeah, so when I'm at a get together, whether it's at a friend's house or my own family or whatever, I'm checking in I'm checking in, seeing hey, what are you guys doing in there? Making
Mm-hmm.
sure that things are, because that's another way that you can prevent abuse from happening.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of strategies. I could do a whole episode on
Yes. Yeah.
prevention, but yeah, I think it's just, educating yourself, being aware of what some of the real research shows on on trauma that happens to children, can be a way to prevent it. Because if you know what to look for and you know what to avoid, you're informed, right?
Yeah.
You're going to interrupt something that could potentially happen.
Yeah. And I think ultimately we probably can't protect our kids from all trauma, right? Like car accidents, fires. I mean, we do the best we can. We change our smoke detector batteries. We, are putting our phones down when we're driving, but like we can't control the other people and things happen, right? That are out of our control. So like, I agree with you. There's a lot of things that we can do just by being informed that prevent trauma from happening in our children's lives and to have conversations with them to disrupt something that could potentially happen and teaching them to trust themselves and these different skills that we can do. But I think ultimately there's some stuff that like we just can't totally control. And the problem on the sexual abuse part especially is the people that are tricky. Not only are they grooming our kids, but they're also grooming us. And so that is a piece that I think when I realized somebody put that into words, I was like, yes, that's why it's so hard is that we're also as grownups being groomed because we're like, yeah, that person is awesome. Like they love my kid. And that's not that, the people that love our kids are grooming our kids. That's not the same, right? Most people are good in this world.
Oh yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think, remembering that is true. But I think sometimes you're right, so afraid of the people we don't know, but we need to be maybe being as protective or aware of the people that we do know that we've already let in our circle, right? Because they may extort that trust to do something. And so being cautious about that, it's hard. Yeah.
It is hard. Yeah. And I don't say that to scare people, but it is, it's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate situation that moms have to and dads have to be aware of to at least have some knowledge and some scrutiny of who's spending time with their children.
Yeah.
It's just a reality. And you're right. We can't protect them from everything. And I saw a quote this week that said, as a parent, it's not our job to protect our child from every emotional pain. It's our job for them not to be alone in their pain.
Mm-hmm.
So they are going to experience some hard things. They are going to have trauma. They are going to struggle and have pains, but it's not our job to necessarily stop all of that. It's when things happen, it's our job to be there for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such an important piece because there's so much of their lives that, we're not at school. And there's also abuse that happens within schools, within sports, right? Things that we think we can trust. And it's just being consciously aware of that part of educating our kids, right? Teaching them to trust themselves. I think about especially like tricky people or like what they deserve, right? That they're a valuable human and they deserve kindness and respect. And that's what we should also be showing to other people, right? Like I think sometimes parents also find their kids being the bully and they're like, how did this happen? Right. And so it's like, I think, it's lots of education, but grace and those kind of things. So I'll move on to a little bit different topic, but like having a tribe and raising kids is such an important thing of other supportive people, right? That's an important part. And as a parent, that's something that I have had to grow in because I have been such an independent person that letting other people in to help me do things that I am capable of doing is hard. So I'm growing in that area, but having a tribe of people who do love your kids and do want to help raise your kids in a healthy way is so important. So I think, sometimes our kids are experiencing traumas. How do we educate the tribe, right? Like, so something happens to our kids that we're identifying, or they're having a behavior disruption or something. And we're like, I'm thinking this is trauma, or I know it's trauma, right? How do we give the words to those people in their lives or our lives that are important, that are supportive people to help continue to support them?
Yeah. So one of the strategies I teach for preventing trauma and just for like keeping kids safe is the hand of safety. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you've heard of this. You
Yeah.
may have heard this before,
Yeah.
but having like at least three people, three fingers. I have my funky nail color today.
I love it. Yeah.
My summer colors. Having at least three people on your hand of safety that the child can go to besides you.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes kids don't want to come to their parent. They're afraid of how they'll react. They're afraid that they'll upset them, hurt their feelings, whatever. And so having three trusted people that they can turn to, whether it's a teacher, a neighbor, an aunt, somebody, three other adults that they can go to who are designated as like their safe people.
Yeah.
And then notifying those people that they have been designated as the safe people is crucial because, they may be mandated reporters. And so, they would have to have a different response than, say, an aunt would have to have,
Sure.
So, and letting the child know those differences too is important. But having and then talking to those people inside your circle and saying, my child really trusts you and would like to come to you if there's ever a problem or there's something that's upsetting to them. They'd like to, have you on their hand of safety. And would you be willing to do that? Would you be willing to be a soundboard? And you don't have to solve it. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to, but, if they come to you, would you be willing to listen? And offering, I would do the same for you. I would be honored if your child wanted to consider me the same. Talking about it is the most important. We talked earlier about prevention of trauma. And one of the greatest ways we can prevent trauma is by talking about it with our circle and our friends. Because when we talk about it and we tell others that we are taking precautions that we know that abuse happens, that we know these, threats are out there and that we're teaching our children, body safety and autonomy and, assertiveness and all these things. It takes the target off of your circle because people that are perpetrators look for people who are unprotected.
Mm-hmm.
They look for people who the adults around them are kind of clueless and aren't very involved. That's why children in foster care, children who are more vulnerable to abuse and human trafficking, because perpetrators look for those who are unprotected. And so just by having that circle and everyone knowing that you have a circle and that your child can go to multiple people to talk to if they're upset, like that insulates you and protects you, because typically the perpetrators are close to your circle, like as we mentioned. So if they know you're talking about it and they know you're educated and they know your kid is educated, you no longer are of interest to them.
Yeah. You're not going to be a very good candidate.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's another way to prevent, protect, and also sort of talk about these things. And I had a really hard time. I have like a ladies text chain, that of all my closest friends. And I got really bold a couple of months ago and like shared on that text string, like, hey, here's this podcast about keeping our kids safe. And I really want you all to listen to it and all this stuff. I was so afraid to hit the send button because it was about sexual abuse. I was so afraid to hit the send button because I was like, what are they going to think? What they're going to think I'm like going off the deep end here? They're going to judge me for being, a nervous Nancy or whatever, And so many responses were like, thank you so much for bringing this up. Thank you so much for being brave enough to say something. Like, yes, we all need to come together and like have a circle of support around this to prevent things from happening and to just be more aware. So if you're nervous to talk about it with your friends, I encourage you to use my example and just do it anyway, because we're all thinking about it. We're all worried about it. I think it's just an instinctual thing to worry about your kids' well-being. And so they're thinking about it too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard, this job, but also like we talked about, such a rewarding one. But yeah, there's so many challenges and we come with our own stuff, right? Like your own traumas of like revealing something and somebody not handling it well. And then you think maybe everybody will do that, right? So like just being aware of that. I know that parents are doing the best they can. I truly believe that. And I know that we don't all have the same skill set. But are there things that you think that parents may be unknowingly doing that might be traumatizing their kids?
Oh, yeah, a lot. Sorry, not to laugh, but I see it all the time. The shaming. I see parents shaming their kids for crying. Little boy or little girl falls down and, is having a meltdown and starts crying, and it's like, stop crying, you're fine. And they're like, this is ridiculous. You're being ridiculous. Come on. Do you see so-and-so crying? They're not crying. Like it's all the shaming parents do, that it's just comes so natural to them because it's often what was done to them. And so it just kind of blurts out of us. But, the shaming and the shutting down of emotions and stop crying. What are you crying for? It's that rejection of emotion that I think we most frequently is the kind of trauma that we're causing. We don't realize it. And again, I have empathy for adults in that situation because I've been there a million times where I'm like, just stop crying, and it's like, it's all we're doing when we shut down a child's emotions. We think we're stopping it, right? We think we've stopped it for that moment, but all we've done is like pushed it into another behavior. It's just going to come out in a different direction, in a different way, in a different manifestation. So maybe it's going to come out with irritability, or maybe it's going to come out with a big tantrum later on, or maybe it's going to come out with disobedience, or, I hate that word. I don't know why I keep using it, but like, back talk, or maybe it's going to come out with refusing to put your shoes on an hour from now, but it's going to come out eventually. And oftentimes in worse ways than if you let them cry. So I think that's one of the things that a disservice that we do to children that is harmful when we force them to stop their emotions with fear. And oftentimes we use fear, we use our anger and fear to stop them. And so I think that's definitely a way. Other ways I think is with high parental conflict, when you have parents who are very volatile and have a lot of conflict and are fighting and screaming at one another and all that. And again, that can be repeating what they saw and they think that's normal. But for some children, that can be traumatizing at a certain point. Now, I'm not saying you're never going to have conflict. That would be unrealistic. We're all going to have conflict, but how intense is that conflict and how often is the child feeling that? And that's definitely a source that I think a common source that we try to dismiss and overlook. But yeah, I think that can definitely be traumatizing for children.
You were saying earlier about believing our kids, right? I think in our last podcast, I think that's one of the ways that we can inadvertently cause additional trauma is to not believe them. And sometimes it's hard, right? Because with the narrative that they're saying is not something we want to hear sometimes, or whatever the circumstances are, that we dismiss that. And by invalidating their experience, that can cause them to turn more internal. And then we see like also physical manifestations, right? Like the stomach aches, the headaches, right? Too, of like, if we aren't able to get the feeling out the way we originally wanted to, that sometimes it manifests internally.
Yeah, definitely. That's it. That is a common one that I've seen when I talk with adults about their trauma is that, my parent didn't believe me. Nobody thought it was true. And then it's just like this denial. Yeah. So I think anytime we're denying a child's reality or we refuse to give them an opportunity to share their experiences and have them validated, because all feelings are valid. You might not agree with them, right? It doesn't mean, just because you validate doesn't mean you agree with it. Like you might not agree with what the child's saying, but you can still validate and say this, but this is how you're, I can see this is how you really feel about this.
Yeah.
Even if you don't agree yet, or if you totally disagree, you can still be empathetic while disagreeing, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. You can acknowledge their reality, because even if it doesn't seem like your reality, it is their reality. And so, they fall, that does really hurt them, right? Even though you're thinking it's not that big of a deal. You're fine, right? You're not bleeding, right? There's no blood. We're fine, right? That doesn't, like, for them, it may be different than that. And how we respond to that is how they're going to internalize or think that they should feel, right? So if they shouldn't feel hurt, but they are, then they're going to say being hurt, having those feelings is bad, so that I'm bad, right? So we sometimes create a narrative for them. And the other thing I think is, and this is hard because we are busy, but just like showing up for our kids, right? I know that there's a lot of constraints and things that get in the way in life, but I think we can inadvertently create feelings, potentially trauma, around just not being available.
Yes, that's a good one. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
We're so distracted, right? We're pulled in a million different directions. And then our phone is also a huge distraction that other generations didn't have. And feeling unseen and unheard is another way to label trauma, a more simpler way. And so I think that really taking the time, and this is like, my most common prescription would be 10 minutes a day of what we call special time, where you put your phone in a drawer, turn it off, or turn the signals off at least, and just spend 10 minutes of your undivided attention just observing your child doing something that they prefer. And not making judgments, not interjecting, not telling them what to do or how to do it, but just being positive and present and observant and just being with the child. And that special time is like filling their bucket. It's building their resilience to go out and face other stressors in the world that inevitably will come up for them. And so when you have this special time every day and they can count on it and they know it's coming and they can even ask for it if they want. If you forget, they can say, hey, can we do special time? Giving them that control and that access to you and knowing that repetitively they're going to get it is very soothing to their nervous system because it helps them feel safe and seen and heard. And more than anything, as humans, that's what we all want, right?
Yes. Yes. To know that we matter, right? That we're here and people notice us. Thanks again, Beth. This has been such a great conversation. I know everybody will really benefit for this. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Again, it was a real pleasure getting to know you today and being with your audience. Thank you.
Thanks again, Beth. That was another fantastic conversation. I always enjoy talking with you. So thanks for being here today. I think there's so much that Beth said that, it's overwhelming to think about what to take away. But I think the thing that I want you to focus on is just how important you are in your kid's life, and that you showing up is one of the most important ways that you can support your child and growing them into this healthy human. But that I will say, if you like what we're doing, please rate and subscribe. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, and also keep the requests coming. We are absolutely loving that. And that's how today worked. We had people sending in emails to talk more about trauma, and we then provided Beth back to you. So please keep that coming. Our email is accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a fantastic day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.